Joseph Stiglitz, before we get into your new book, The Price of Inequality, let's go back to your last book, Free Fall, because it feels like the economy is falling again. What's your view of the American economy right now?
It's not healthy. The fundamental problem, and I predicted this in Free Fall, is that we aren't creating enough jobs for the new entrants in the labor force. You know, the numbers that have been coming out in the last few months, better than zero, but normally we have about 1% growth in the labor force. A lot of them today are not entering the labor force because there's no jobs, but normally 1% entering in the labor force, 2% productivity. That means that unless you're growing 3.5%, you're not growing the economy fast enough. Our numbers are dismal, and the most optimistic numbers are well south of that 3%.
How worried are you about what's happening in Europe contaminating the U.S. economy?
Very. And it's not just the effect directly, but a weakness in Europe affects China, Asia. We're a very globalized economy, and when you have in some sense, the largest economy in the world, if you look at Europe as a whole, that is very sick, there's going to be contagion, both through trade and through financial markets.
You mentioned China. China is slowing, albeit from a very rapid pace. Does that mean we've lost the lender of last resort because they're lending money both to us and to Europe because they're worried about their own problems?
No, I think China is still sitting on a very large reserve, over $3 trillion of reserves. They have the tools, the resources, the incentives to make sure that their economy doesn't collapse. But the fact that they're growing more slowly is going to mean that the global economy is going to be weaker. It'll be reflected in resource prices. It'll be affected in Latin America and Africa most dramatically. But because everything is integrated, it will come back and affect us.
Paul Krugman has been kind of a lightning rod on this issue. He has his own book out called End This Depression Now. Now he says Ben Bernanke isn't doing enough. Do you agree?
I think there's very little that Ben Bernanke can do. You know, the Fed can cause problems. It was one of the major factors causing the current economic downturn with their excess liquidity and their inadequate regulation. But just like in the Great Depression, the Fed is unable really to effectively stimulate the economy. It can prevent the collapse of the banking system. It can't really goose the economy. And that's even worse today than it was in the 30s, because today when you pump liquidity in the system, in a globalized world, the money is going to go where the prospects are the best. The prospects in the United States are not as good as in some of the more dynamic emerging markets. So the problem is the money is going where it's not needed and not going where it's needed.
Speaking of pumping money into the economy, Krugman also suggests pumping billions and billions of borrowed dollars into the U.S. economy to stimulate it. Do you agree with this Keynesian policy as opposed to the austerity that a lot of people are suggesting?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, basically, you look around the world, there's been no experiment with a large economy, and America is a large economy, where austerity has worked. So we know the consequences of austerity. It will depress our economy. On the spending side, the question is, a lot of people ask, can we afford it? The answer is the markets are willing to lend us money at 0, 1.5% long term, and we have a backlog of high return investment projects, infrastructure, technology, education. So if we borrow that money and we invest it well, our balance sheet, our economy is going to be stronger. So to me, this is what we ought to be doing. It'll create jobs now, it'll promote growth in the future.